Good morning. Good morning. This is Valerie Leonard. I'm the founder of Nonprofit Utopia. I want to say thank you so much for joining us. This is the month of May. And for May, we're going to be focusing on how nonprofits can get their message out to the media. So this particular workshop, so to speak, will show you how to craft your message. Also, it will show you how to interact with the media and increase your chances of getting placement. And when I say placement, I'm talking about getting your stories placed either in print, on television, radio, etc. All right. And you might wonder, well, why in the world would nonprofits care about getting their word out? We're all about capacity building. And when I say capacity building, I'm talking about strengthening your organization, and the media is often overlooked as a way of increasing organizational capacity, right? Once you get your message out to the appropriate people, and when I say appropriate people, I'm talking about the people you want to reach, people who could volunteer for you, people who might use your services, people who might give you money, and all of that good stuff. If nobody knows about the good work that you do, it's going to be very, very, very difficult to attract those resources. And you want to get to the point where people know so much about your good work that you begin to attract resources, and you might not have to work quite as hard. It's always a hard job, but you won't have to work quite as hard attracting. All right. So without further ado, I am going to share my screen. And if you have any comments, any questions, please feel free to post. I'm not going to be able to share, to be able to respond until after this presentation, but please feel free to post any questions, any comments, and I will be sure and respond to them. All right, so we're going to talk about how to make your nonprofit story newsworthy. And before we do that, I'd like to always talk to you about Nonprofit Utopia. We're the ideal community for emerging nonprofit leaders, and we have also an online community as well as consulting and coaching to help you to share your thoughts, to improve your organizations. And we have a community, a private community where you can not worry about people invading your privacy and all that good stuff. All right. So our mission is to train the next generation of ethical nonprofit leaders, and we do that through coaching. We do it through an online community as well as consulting and courses. And our vision is to train the next generation of ethical nonprofit leaders around the world between now and 2033. So we want to reach 50,000 people. A little bit about myself, as some of you may know, that I specialize in community and organizational development. Had significant experience, over 30 years of experience, lived experience, as well as professional experience working with communities. I also host the Nonprofit Utopia blog talk radio show, and I teach courses online for UIC. And I've got a master in management from Kellogg in finance and marketing, and an undergrad from Spelman in economics. We got a lot to cover today, and we want to first of all kind of dispel some of the myths around history, your story, and a news story. All too often, I think one of the problems we have in reaching the media or even getting our stories out is we confuse the three. So we're going to show you the differences. We're going to show you how to craft your story. We're going to show you how to develop a newsworthy story. We're also going to show you how to use the media to amplify your message, meaning making it louder, making it broader, help you to reinforce the messages you have internally. We're also going to show you how to pitch your ideas and choose what media are best for you. So the first question is history, story, news story. What's the difference? All right, so a history, as you know, that's the description of past events, right? So it's a timeline describing what happened in the past. A story can happen either in the past or it can be a current story. It talks about current events or past events, and it often is a little bit more developed. We have a setting, a cast of characters, and a plot, and it often involves a hero overcoming a challenge. And then a news story is a discussion or description of a very, very current event that people want to know about or they need to know about. And the operative word here is this current, and we're talking about something that happens today, yesterday, right? So before we talk about the news story, we want to go back to the basics of crafting your story. And this is something that you need to do internally. You always want to be pitching the media, right? But before you do that, it's important that the communication internally, everybody agrees on what stories you want to tell, what stories you want to get out, right? So we all know that every story has a, sorry, every organization has a story. And it's important to be strategic about the ways that you communicate your experiences and your impact. And if you don't tell your story, somebody else will, for better or for worse. And those stories will be based on their impressions. So, you, as a professional running an organization, particularly in the media area, it's up to you to craft the image that you want people to perceive of your organization. Again, if you don't do it, they'll have a perception based on their experience, based on hearsay. And it's important too that you use your story to connect not only with your audiences, but to build a community around your particular organization. And when I say a community, these are people who really, really care about your mission. So these could be funders, these could be clients, it could be employees. All right. And the important thing about telling a story is you can highlight what some of the problems are, how you actually solve those problems, and then you can even forge ongoing emotional connections with your supporters. And it's important that your organization be the one that crafts the narrative, because if you don't craft the narrative, someone else will do it for you. And you want to make sure that this is a narrative for the whole organization, your work, and the work that you do in the community. And this organization is going to be consistent with your mission. So it's going to define why your organization exists, the people you serve, and how you aim to accomplish your goals. And then you want to think of this also as the master narrative, so to speak, that will help you craft the stories, about different projects, different events, different programs, etc. But you want to be strategic about it. So here's an example of how you might consider crafting the overall narrative. Think about the people that you serve. Who are the people who are most impacted by the work you do? You look at your organization's mission and your goals and your vision, right? And then you want to think of similarities between what your audience's goals and hopes are for their lives. And then you want to create a nexus where your message and your organization's goals and objectives can meet your audience's hopes for their lives. And then you want to talk about the problems. What is it that stands between the people that you serve and their long term goals? All right. At this point, it's not so much about the organization, even though your organization ultimately will receive some benefit, but it's really, really important to keep your stories to, um, to the best way possible. Keep them focused on your target, meaning your clients, meaning your community. You want to look at solutions for those problems that will help your organization to address the problems that your community has, that your target has, and then you want to engage people and call them to action, right? So you want to enlist people, who are your stakeholders to do specific things like contribute, volunteer, or help you get the word out. The next thing you want to think about is your character and setting. Think of yourself as a playwright, so to speak. Even though you're working for an organization as its executive director or program manager, still think about telling a story. Who's telling the story, right? So it's important to consider who's going to tell the story and how their point of view is going to affect the narrative. So if you're a receptionist, your perspective is going to be a little bit different from a board member. The board member story is going to be a little bit different from your client's perspective. The program manager story is going to be a little different. I think one of the challenges we have is we tend to tell stories from our own perspective, meaning the organization or the one who's doing the work, without necessarily aligning the story with that perspective. Sometimes there is a disconnect between the person telling the story and the person who the story is about. So you need to think about, is the narrator a part of the story or external to it? So are you telling the story first person about your own experience, or are you telling the story or helping your client to tell a story? Are you watching the story unfold, or are you looking back on something that has already happened? And who's the main character? Who's the hero? Some of your most effective stories include your clients as the hero, but you can also include your volunteers as heroes of this, depending on the situation. But the most effective stories are told from the perspective of an individual rather than us being talking heads. All right. So you want to describe the person and the situation that they find themselves in at the beginning of the story. And in the ideal sense, you want them to tell about themselves and the predicament they found themselves in. So who are some of the other characters? So this is where the supporting cast comes in. Who is the hero, who might be the villain? And in some cases, when we're talking about, now, for example, gentrification, the villain might be a developer who is trying to displace people, right? And the heroes are those tenants or residents who are standing their ground, making sure that the developers come and respect the community. So you want to describe the roles and develop the characters of each one of the characters in the story so people understand who's who in the relationship between the characters. And then you want to describe, what's that aha moment? At what point were your main characters' eyes open to the need? At what point did they see that there's a problem? At what point did they see that there's a potential that they could do something about it, right? So you want to recreate the moment when the person realized, hey, we got to do something about it. And this can also, help you to convey to your audience, a heart to heart story, because in many instances, people in your audience may have had similar experiences, or they might be trying to help someone with similar experiences. All right. So in this particular example about a village in Africa where people needed to actually improve the drinking water, they noticed that the water had always been bad. They had come to accept bad water as a way of life. And then the next part is, once you have kind of reached that aha moment, right? There is a decision point, right? There are doubts that begin to arise. So you want to talk about the point at which people began to question, why are we dealing with this dirty water? Is there something we can do about it? Do we have to accept the status quo? So you want to state the doubts or concerns in the voice of the main character. What would he or she say? So if the main character is someone who's living in this African village where there is, unclean water, right? So you want to try to get into that character's head, and ideally you want to have that character to voice his or her concern. So, for example, this dirty stream was the only water source we had ever known. So at that point, you want to talk about solutions, what idea, inspiration, or change occurred that pointed toward a possible solution. So in this case, you could say one day the villagers heard that a drilling rig could be used to find a new source of water, but a deep ravine stood between their village and the road the rig would need to travel. All right, so they began to think about ways they could address their problems. All right, so next you need to, talk about what people have done in terms of a sequence of events. So what was the first thing that they did, right? What was the second thing? And what are their actions? What are they trying to achieve, right? So in this example, the villagers came together to discuss how to build a road around the ravine. And then you have to think, okay, so what did they do? What did they talk about? What did they decide to do? When they looked at their issue, what were some of the things that they came across that could potentially be a barrier to them actually reaching their goals? So you need to not only look at, the alternatives of what they could possibly do, but then look at the obstacles, right? So, what are some of their challenges? And then, like, how do they address them? So, for example, it would take months of hard work to build a road, and some doubted it could be done. And the reason why they had their doubts is, this was a remote village, and they didn't have access to the resources in terms of a lot of the technology to build this road, and they didn't have necessarily have the skills, right? So they began to talk about what it would take to actually reach their goal, and then in so doing they thought about, what allies do we need. So if there are allies who are helping you join the work, think about who they are, what role they play. And then you want to show people involved and created solutions to their own problems, as well as others who support the cause. And it's really, really important that the people who are impacted are the ones who are highlighted in the story. They're the ones who are driving the change. One of the worst things you can do is create a scenario where you are coming from on high to help people who could do nothing for themselves. Again, you want to be the support. And in this example, um, again, we're talking about a village in Africa where people had water, dirty water. The families throughout the village contributed materials and labor to work on the road, and this allowed the rigs to access their region. All right, so they saw that there was a contractor in a neighboring village, but there were also some obstacles. So, who would work together to make sure that they could get those rigs, to the proper places and begin to drill the wells? So some of the allies were the, the company that had the rigs, but also people in the village who were neighbors. And then, apparently they have already identified actions, but what are some of the other actions that need to be taken after the allies join? So, for example, the people of the village and the rig workers joined forces to transport the rig and set up the drill for water. And then when we talk about the breakthrough, at what point did they realize that, they actually had a chance to win this battle? So in this example, the people in the village realized that they had a chance of winning, or there was a turning point in their situation when the rig actually hit water. So they were at a point now where people began to think it was possible, they could see it was possible, and then that built momentum. And then when you tell the story, you need to think also about the impact of your work on people's lives. So in this example, the people in the area had access to clean, safe water for drinking, cooking, and cleaning. That created a much more sanitary environment. Um, the prospect for disease, disease could be more easily controlled because they had access to clean water. And then you want to highlight some of the lessons that are learned. So think of a specific lesson that the audience can take away from your story and add a specific action that they can take in order to help your cause. So in this example, Charity Water, that's the name of the organization, they included a strong call to action. You can help us bring clean water to communities like this. All right. So the call to action for you, what actions can your audience take to help you advance your call? And you need to think about the fact that your story has inspired and informed people, right? So you already laid the groundwork and you want to use that point to get people to actually do something. And that something could be things like, give you money, volunteer, and all of that, right? Okay, so we have much more information and a couple more videos. I didn't want to drag this one out too long because, our purpose is to focus on the media. So if you want to learn more about nonprofit storytelling, you can check out Own Your Narrative, the Power of Storytelling to Build Brand and Community. We give you step-by-step real examples as to how you can more effectively tell your story. And then we also have another video, how to develop a nonprofit marketing and communications plan. So you really should start with the marketing and communications plan, and then you talk about your narrative and telling your story. And now we're talking today about how you can leverage that story to get more media attention. So, how do we actually translate the stories into news? All right. So, you need to first of all, you know, think about your narrative, right? So, you've actually written the story, but what is it about that story that people want or need or even care to know, right? And think about too what journalists are looking for in the story. So, when we talk about journalists, we're talking about reporters, we're talking about talk show hosts, we're talking about radio personalities. What are they looking for when they decide to have you as a guest on a show? What are they looking for when they decide to write a story? So, one of the first things they want to look at is how timely is this issue and how timely is your story? How have you been able to weave your story into the timeliness of an issue that a lot of people think is important, right? So your stories really have a shelf life. Think of them, think of it like bread, right? Or baked goods. There's a shelf life after, a couple days, the stories get really short. I mean, they get really stale. So you really need to make sure that you strike while the iron is hot, but don't strike before you're ready, right? So you want to make sure your story is complete before you approach the media. That's why you go through that exercise of actually creating the narrative, developing your story, and then you're ready to pitch. Another thing that journalists look for is proximity. Remember, it's all about, where your organization is located. The people who care about your issue, 9 times out of 10, there are people who live right in that same community, right? So people are more interested in homegrown news, so to speak, than news from faraway places. Just like all politics is local, the news is local. So, for example, a toxic waste dump in Russia, it's kind of interesting, but it's more interesting if that toxic waste dump is in your neighborhood. right? You really, really care about it. So people in the neighborhood who are impacted really, really care about it. And then journalists also look at the impact of the story. What are the consequences of this issue, of this story, and how do you create a nexus in terms of creating a solution? And if you bear with me, I gotta make sure I don't go offline. Um, how do you create a nexus between the impact and the consequences and your organization as having the solution to this story? I mean, to this issue, right? So, in your story, you're going to have to ask the question, does this matter? And does your story pass the so what test? And who cares? And then you have to answer the question, what happens if nothing is done? What are the consequences to the community if we can't do anything? Why is this important to the people? What happens to the community if they don't take any action? The next thing that journalists care about is the novelty of the story, or the fact that it's unusual or rare. All right. So there's an old saying in the news business that when a dog bites a man, it's not news. But I guarantee you, if it were the other round, if a man bites a dog, that would be newsworthy. And another example is, for a while, U.S. churches sending missions teams to Russia was big news. And then it got to a point where so many people were doing it, then it was no longer news. So when you have an issue or your story is something it seems like it's very, very common, everybody else is doing, it's it's incumbent upon you to actually think of a new and different angle that nobody else has thought to look at. So for example, an issue right now for me that's near and dear to my heart is redistricting. That is maps that are drawn for political purposes. And I believe that nonprofits should get involved in that, because nonprofits in many instances are the only advocates that some of our communities have. And the redistricting process impacts representation, which impacts the level of services that you can provide for your community. So everybody is talking about redistricting right now, because every 10 years after the census, we go through that. And, what you hear in the media are, battles between Democrats and Republicans about whether or not we should engage in gerrymandering. How should we make sure redistricting is fair? Now, what's novel or what's rare is you don't hear that many Black people talking about redistricting, let alone having Black people come up with a plan of action that they want to produce and share with their legislators rather than accept the plan that's given. All right. So that would be one angle, right? Another thing that journalists are concerned about or they care about is conflict. As long as people are not getting along, that's kind of interesting, right? Seeing the Democrats and Republicans have their fight, right? Or seeing developers and low income communities go back and forth and fight, that always makes for a good story, right? But when you have a story where everybody's getting along, unfortunately, even though that's a good thing, right? It's not always as newsworthy. But it can be newsworthy if historically people don't get along and all of a sudden they're getting along, right? So you have to figure out ways that you can use that conflict angle to your best interest, if it's relevant. Another thing that journalists care about is human interest. And typically, as people, we're always interested in other people. Sometimes it feels to me like we're more interested in our pets than people. But the truth of the matter is, we still care about people. All right. So we tend to be voyeuristic, looking at other people's lives, right? I believe that's why reality TV has taken on, such a high priority I guess, in programming because we like to see what's going on with other people's lives. All right, so when we look at a fire burning down in an empty building, that's not quite as interesting as a fire that has displaced someone or killed someone. I mean, it's bad news, but that has created something, a gut reaction in us that keeps us interested. We want to understand, okay, how did this happen? Who was impacted? How can we help? Or did we catch the person or did the police catch the person who set the fire? So, people are very interested in that stuff. So we need to create stories that have that kind of impact around, for people who could potentially help us. All right. So we want to make sure we got stories where people can really identify, even if they haven't had that direct experience, they can identify, they can empathize with what's going on. Another thing that journalists are looking for is prominence. Is there anybody with a high profile who is associated with that story? All right. So in this example, Bob Johnson, he's a farmer in Nebraska. He has an affair. Nobody really knows who Bob Johnson is. That's not really news. But, if our president were to do it or the head of a large organization were to do it, then that becomes news, right? So if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to post in chat. I will go through the chat after I get through with this. As you can imagine, there are a number of benefits to using the media to spread your message. And when I say media, I'm talking about radio, I'm talking about television, I'm talking about print, I'm talking about websites, right? So how do we use all of these things and more YouTube? How do we use these things to spread our message, right? And why should we do it? What do we get out of it? First of all, they can provide cheap, immediate coverage. I was just at a press conference yesterday and I was a little disappointed that we didn't have the media presence that I would have liked. So we had the presence of mind to videotape that press conference and we posted, in our own social media. And now we're starting to get a little traction, right? So it's really, really important to be able to create news cheaply. And if you're in a position where you have actually had a successful news conference, right, your story gets carried on many channels, and that can, again, raise awareness. It can show impact. It can actually help you create impact. It can help you connect with diverse audiences. They can also, if you play it right, they can give you the possibility of playing the same story over and over again. But be cautious. When you play the story over and over again, you got to make sure you have a different angle. So at that point, you might want to focus on issues, right? The issue is the story, but then your media coverage, each time has to be a little different. So for example, I can remember when I was, real active in my community in North Lawndale, when schools were closing, we had a mayor that closed 50 schools. So that was a real hotbed issue. That was an issue that stayed in the news for several months. So we made sure that we stayed out there on the issue for those several months. So that meant us keeping up with what was going on with the Board of Education and then having our own response to whatever policies. And then again, making sure that we weren't repeating what other people said, or if we were responding, making sure that if there are several others responding, that we were able to differentiate ourselves and speak from a different perspective than others. All right, so it's important too to remember that news stories give you credibility. Not that you're not credible. At least most nonprofits are credible, but once you get in the media, that tends to elevate your profile and reputation, and it solidifies in people's mind that you're an expert on this issue, and not that you're a lawyer or a professional media person, but people begin to look at you and your organization as spokespeople and experts on that particular issue that you're addressing, and then you are more believable, and then media start coming to you, right? Um, Using various forms of media can help you reach different segments of your target audiences, right? So you have to be mindful of who you're trying to reach when you choose certain types of media. And then the media can also help you to be comprehensive in your explanation of an issue. And the best part is much of this media are free, but the coverage is free. All right, so when we look at the newsworthy angles, there are many angles that you might use to get your name out there. And when I talk about angles, we're talking about what perspectives can you use to make your story more attractive, right? So there's the anniversary story, all right? Can you associate your story, your program, your project with a local or national or topical or historical event, all right? A good example would be marking the 50th anniversary of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to a story on how nuclear waste has affected the groundwater in New Mexico, right? And the anniversary in question might be one that's connected to your organization as well. And it's important that it's relevant. You don't want to have something that's totally disconnected, but you also want to make sure that whatever you attach yourself to has relevance to the community. And then it doesn't necessarily have to be something that's outside of the community. It could be your own anniversary, right? So when your organization has an anniversary, say a 5-year anniversary, 10-year anniversary, the fact that you survived that long, that could be, if you structure it properly, that could be newsworthy. A breakthrough, what's new or different about this story? Does it relate to a turning point of some source, of some sort? For example, with the coronavirus, when the, I'm sorry, when the vaccinations came online, that was a breakthrough, right? Um, Another breakthrough type of story is, suppose we have a slow economy and our president issues a stimulus package. So, what issue are you working on, right? It seems to be an entrenched issue, but your organization, your program is providing a breakthrough. Another angle you can use is highlight the celebrity that is associated with your event, with your program. Are they, is a celebrity willing to be a spokesperson for your organization, a spokesperson for your event to raise money, to get people involved, to give you credibility? So here's an example, Bono, he's a well-known human rights aid activist, right? And he helps a lot of organizations that help developing countries. Again, controversial topics. What are the hot button issues in your community that people are definitely taking sides on? What side is your organization taking? What solutions are you bringing to the table? It's one thing for you to rattle the cages, right? And say, oh, woe is me, the organization, or woe is the woe are the people in the community. But if you don't come with any solutions, it doesn't really make your story newsworthy. All right. Controversial topics. One topic might be, how do minority groups look at redistricting versus the way politicians look at it, or white people? And if there are differences, if there are problems, And if you're part of a minority group, or if you're helping a minority group, what is it that this minority group going to do, right? How are we impacted, right? And what solutions do we have to solve our own problems? Another hot button issue is abortion and right to life, right? How does the Catholic Church feel about right to life advocates who don't oppose the death penalty, right? So that dynamic tension, social justice, and in, ah, uncovered injustice. Are there basic inequalities or unfair circumstances to be reported? And are you looking at the issue from a perspective of equity versus equality? The age-old problem. Why can't minority problems often get the same kinds of housing loans as middle class white people? And not only raise the question, but again, share some solutions. Is there an ironic situation, or is there any hypocrisy involved? So one example is, how can alcohol manufacturers support a don't drink and drive campaign? However, they're not doing anything to change their ads, right, to encourage people not to drink. All right, so now we're going to talk about choosing good media opportunities. And when we talk about opportunities, we're talking about things that are not within your control, but you're taking advantage of what's going on external to the organization in order to reach the people that you want to reach with your story. So an example is local, national, or regional events that tie to your organization's work, right? So one example is the opening day of a national conference on teen pregnancy. That could be a good time to highlight your work on the same issue. So you look at, what's going on around you. If it's a hot button topic, link, link yourself and your perspective to that story. Holidays are another way, right? A good holiday that people like to use: Martin Luther King Day, 4th of July, Memorial Day, Cinco de Mayo. How can you use those holidays to highlight the work you do? Not just highlighting the holiday itself, but how are you tapping into those holidays to make a difference in the lives of your clients and communities? Looking at a high school prom, that's a good time to run an article on preventing teen pregnancy, all right? Since prom night might correspond to increased teen sexual intercourse, or an article on the relationship between alcohol consumption and teen sexuality. And, you might also want to relate that to drunk driving, you know. In the event that you don't have a breaking story on the media's plate, you can try to create your own news. I told you about the example where we had a press conference. We got some media, not quite as much as I'd like, but we are starting to create our own story, right? Now, when it comes to speaking with a reporter, you don't just call the reporter off the top of your head or go off half cocked, right? You want to be prepared. So you want to prepare a script of what you might say. And of course, you don't want to sound like you're reading, but have some talking points in place as you pitch your story. It shouldn't be any more than 3 sentences, and the highlights should be in the first paragraph, right? You should have your one pager about your organization, how it is addressing the issue. And ideally, you want to have, the news is not really your organization. Let's be clear. The news is a hot button issue that everybody cares about, and ways your organization can solve that problem, or ways that issue is impacting the people that you serve in your community. All right. So you don't want, it's very, very hard, I would say, to, especially for people who are dealing with policy and advocacy, that redistricting stuff is a good example. The TIF stuff, is another example. When stuff is really complicated and you can only speak in sound bites, you want to have documents where people can be educated, but your pitch is not going to be all of that detailed stuff. You don't want to lose people. All right. You also want to have other people who can contribute to the story, have them lined up. So in the event that the person interviewing you gets through, it's common for them to say, "Oh, are there other people I can talk to?" Because they want to have a well-rounded story. So you want to make sure that you have those people lined up before you even talk to the journalist. And then you want to have, again, it's one thing to raise the issue, it's another thing to scream about a problem, a social injustice, a social inequity. But it's another thing for you to come prepared with a solution and a step-by-step plan as to how you're going to address the issue. All right. And then you have to also be ready to answer the questions. Why now? Why is it important? Who cares? Why should anybody care? And then, you could take it one step further. Think of all the negative stuff. Think if you were an enemy of your issue, your people, and try to come up with the opposite approach. And that will help you in the event that there's some hardball questions being asked. All right, you need to target people who are covering your topic. All right, so in order to find out the reporters who cover your topic, you might want to get the yellow book. And a really good resource is Public Narrative here in Chicago. They have a directory of resources in the media. You should also take a clue from looking at the journalists who have written stories, in the newspapers, and those stories may be similar to something your organization does, or you might have an opinion about it. So you might want to pitch them on a story. And if your initial contact isn't interested in what you have to say, ask them who they might recommend that you talk to in order to get your story placed. All right. And then if you have no clue as to what reporter you need to talk to specifically, then just contact the newsroom of the newspaper, and if the people in the newsroom like your story, they'll pitch it to the appropriate person. And it's important too to respect the reporter's time. You don't want to call reporters late in the day because they're under deadline. Best time to call them is between 10 and 2. You want to keep your pitch brief. You want to be relaxed and calm, but be enthusiastic. And you also, it's not enough to just be a good talker. You got to make sure that you have some facts, because you don't want to come across as someone who's just fluffy. Um, you want to have some data to back up those stories. If you have an answer machine, make sure you have, uh, leave a message for them, a detailed message um, about what you're calling for. Get a slow pitch there. And you want to make sure that you call at different times. But whatever you do, don't call at the last minute unless you have breaking news. And another time you might want to call at the last minute is to make sure that people are actually coming to cover your story. And you want to position your organization so that, the people in the media think of your organization first when they're covering a particular topic. So you always want to be reachable. You always want to have answers to questions. You always want to be in a position where if you don't have the answers, or if this is not a story that directly concerns you or your organization, that you're a resource and you can give them reliable people that they can go to. So you also have to remember that this is a relationship business. You want to pitch stories often, meaning you want to try to push your particular story, but you don't want to become a nuisance, and you also want to make sure that it's actually news. And you want to also get into a habit of pitching X number of stories a year to increase your chances of one, being placed, but two, to maintain the relationships and to also position your organization as a go-to thought leader on a certain issue. And even if you don't get a story out of all of these pitches, you're beginning to develop relationships. And you have to remember this is not a one-shot deal. This is something you have to do early and often. All right. So with that said, I'm going to see if there are any questions. If there are any questions or comments, just let me know. All right. All right. So, Robert Douglas, this is the fun stuff. If you're still there, thank you so much for that. Yes, it is the fun stuff. It's not easy, but it is fun. Robert Douglas, giving the game away. Yes, that's what I do. Give the game away. If you are a member of the Nonprofit Utopia community, we will have for you, once we're done with this series, we'll have a media kit for you that you can use to develop your own stories. We also have office hours so that we can work with you. All right. Very thoroughly brought forth. Thank you so much, Leslie. I definitely appreciate that. All right. Are there any questions, any comments? All right. So if there are no further questions, no further comments, I want to say thank you so much for joining us this morning. I really appreciate your taking the time out of your schedule. All right. So without further ado, I am going to say goodbye and thank you again.